I really like gaming on ultrawide monitors. Something about the aspect ratio that fills my peripheral vision really aids in the immersion, regardless of the genre of game. Sadly, most ultrawides are either heinously expensive or just painfully bad. But can this UK-based X equals brand offer the best of the markets, offer one of the cheapest 1440p high refresh rate 34-inch ultrawides that are on the market, and also one of the best? Well, let's test it and find out. Now first, let's cover the specs. This is the X equals XG34UWQ, a 34-inch 3440 by 1440 160Hz curved VA panel with adaptive sync, backlight strobing, and 3 overdrive modes, not including off. It quotes an 8 millisecond grey-to-grey response time, 400 nits of peak brightness, and a 4000 to 1 contrast ratio. I/O-wise, it supports 2 DisplayPort 1.4 ports, 1 HDMI 2.0, DC in, audio out, and a USB port for basically just updating the monitor's firmware. Physically, it's definitely on the cheaper side. While the monitor does attach to the stand in a tool-free fashion, the mounting mechanism has an unsettling amount of play. Meaning whenever you try and even just adjust the monitor, like, kind of tilt it one way or the other, the lower edge of the monitor pulls away from the mount itself. Now, to be clear, the mount is perfectly secure. I have no worries about this randomly falling off in the middle of the night and destroying itself, but it does speak to the overall build quality. In fact, adjusting the monitor's sort of tilt angle actually tells you a lot about the sacrifices you make in buying one of the cheapest options on the market. You can see just how, well, uneven, in fact you might even be able to hear as I'm talking, how much the entire monitor flexes. I'm only putting a small amount of force, in fact not enough force to even change the position of the stand here, but the entire panel is flexing and even one corner is lifting off of the table as I wobble it around. When uprights, the base can also be a cause of instability, both from its rather sort of shallow design, which doesn't take up much of your desk space, which is nice, but also means that if you do try and actually adjust the monitor sort of tilt angle, you basically just pull the monitor over, even when using 2 hands. Also, if your desk surface isn't perfectly flat and level, because this base is basically just a flat piece of metal with some very thin rubber feet on the bottom, if it's not perfectly flat, then it just sort of wobbles on that point. It will rest somewhere in the middle and then just, tilt or rock around with any level of motion at all, and can be very easy to move by accident. When it comes to the on-screen displays controls, well, those are the old school, downward facing individual buttons that are labeled on the bottom face. I would much prefer to see a joystick style switch like most other manufacturers have already adopted on the back, sort of to the side, which ends up being a lot more ergonomic and easier to use. The menu itself is also pretty retro, with basically just 3 black and white columns for each layer of the settings. The main options that you'll frequent are the picture quality settings and other, with picture quality setting including the response time option, which is just their name for overdrive. Here you have 4 total options. You have the off, and then immediately under off is high, then middle, and then low. As for the other settings, that's where you'll find your adaptive sync control for FreeSync or G-Sync, which does work just fine. MPRT, which is their way of saying backlight strobing, basically turning the display or the backlight off for all but 1 millisecond per frame to hypothetically improve the motion performance, although in practice it doesn't do anything to improve the pixel response time, and it gives me an almost instant headache, so I can't use it. It also dims the brightness very significantly. It also has the option to enable or disable flicker free, which honestly confused the hell out of me. Because if you don't know, flicker-free as a branding normally refers to the monitor using what's called a DC backlight control, basically changing the voltage going to the LED or LEDs, rather than a PWM, pulse width modulated backlight controller, as the latter is basically just turning the backlight on and off hundreds or thousands of times per second, which can cause somewhat imperceptible but painful or, headaches or even just eye strain and that sort of flicker. Having the option to enable or disable flicker free seems somewhat impossible, as DC control and PWM are two completely different hardware designs. So the only way that would work, or that could even potentially make sense, is that it is still using a PWM backlight, but it's using a very high frequency, say 10 kilohertz or 10,000 times per second or higher, and disabling that setting, or setting that to disabled, changes the frequency to a much lower value, which in and of itself would require more advanced hardware than is normally included anyway. But even if they did include that hardware to do that, that still doesn't actually make any sense. And further to that, testing with my open source response time tool, I found functionally no difference between the setting being enabled or disabled, and at different backlight levels, not just at 100%. So, in fact, actually setting the setting to off actually reduced the noise ever so slightly. Like I said, I'm very, very confused. Now, since we're talking about the panel and its response times, well, let's talk about them. That 8 millisecond gray to gray they quote, I'll be honest, is being very, very optimistic. Even on its maximum overdrive setting, the best initial response time I got averages out to 9.5 milliseconds, and the perceived response time, the time including any overshoots, well, that's more like 13 milliseconds. With overdrive off, it's more like 21 milliseconds for both, which is just awful. That's represented in the UFO test, where you get 5 to 7 ghosted frames on screen at the start of a new frame draw, and even then, to the eye, it's very, very visible. Even with the overdrive on high, you still end up with 4 to 5 ghosted frames on screen at once, which again is pretty lackluster, pretty visible, although it is fairly typical for VA or vertical alignment panels. You might have been wondering just how a 21 millisecond average response time equates to up to 7 frames on screen at any one time. I mean, at 160 Hz, each new frame is being drawn every 6.25 milliseconds, which would imply more like 3 frames at a time. Well, see, this is why. This is the light level captured during the RGB 0 or full black to RGB 51, middling or sort of darker grey shade. And during that transition, the x-axis is time, 150 milliseconds of it, and the y-axis is the light level. For some context, I'll add in a transition from my most recent monitor review before this one, the BenQ EX2710Q. It won't be perfectly lined up, but you should get the idea. The orange BenQ line completes the transition in around 3 milliseconds. But our x equals here? Well, even if you are charitable and subtract the, face it, antiquated 10% of the light level tolerance, it still takes just shy of 50 milliseconds. And if you are strict about how long it actually takes, well, then that's more like 84 milliseconds. 84 even the clipped 50 milliseconds is painful and nicely lines up with what you see on screen. Normally, that sort of issue is meant to be solved by overdrive. And sure, with overdrive set to high, the complete response time is down to more like 65 milliseconds, and the 10% time is more like 36, down from 50. But that's still really, really bad. From looking at, honestly, hundreds of these graphs just for this monitor, I've been drawn to the somewhat inescapable conclusion that the overdrive profiles are not tuned or validated, possibly at all, at least for this panel. The darker transitions have literally zero overshoots, meaning the pixels aren't being driven all that hard. But the middling transitions, like this RGB 0 to 153, have horrific peaks to 40% higher than the end light level. Much like a car's fuel or boost map, the monitor's scaler holds a similar table that it looks through to find how hard to overdrive any given pixel and for how long to set it at that overdriven state before bringing it back down to the actual target. This monitor doesn't appear to have had that table actively calibrated and fine-tuned to offer the best experience to you, the user. This ends up being pretty visible to the eye, as even in the UFO test, the undershooting of the bright red of the UFO to the sort of middling, slightly darker green makes the trail very both dark and noticeable. In games, even fast-paced games, with the overdrive setting set to its maximum setting, I was mostly able to ignore the sort of slow panel and focus on clicking some heads. I mean, they're bots' heads, but that's kind of the limit of my talent, so I'll take it. Well, any sort of fast motion did make it relatively difficult to make out the between 4 to 8 copies of the enemy I was meant to be aiming at any given moment. For anything where motion or motion blur wouldn't be a genuine hindrance, I could see let's say less ghosting sensitive players being mostly fine with this. With the overdrive off though, it was pretty unplayable. It was very jelly-like. It was almost sort of a tube train turning around a corner feel to it, sort of that weird parallax motion. Honestly, slightly verging on nauseating for me personally. I would definitely be keeping this on the high response time setting at all times. As for the input lag, that seemed a little hit or miss. My time sleuth reported around a 5 millisecond average, which isn't exactly perfect. Many other monitors offer more like 1 millisecond or lower, but I would take that result with a pinch of salt, as the time sleuth caps out at displaying 1080p 60 FPS and 16:9 1080p, thanks to the FPGA that actually runs everything being a little underpowered for anything higher end, which means that the monitor's scaler is having to take in that 16:9 1080p signal and upscale it to 3440 by 1440, which will add some delay, so that might be something to consider there. Luckily, I also test the total system or click-to-photon latency using NVIDIA's LDAT tool, which had some equally pretty mixed results. Multiple sets ran in the 30 to 40 millisecond average range, which is pretty poor, but some runs averaged a much more respectable like 22 milliseconds, which is a lot better and pretty decent. That was with adaptive sync enabled while playing CSGO, so again there could be something perhaps firmware related that a firmware update could help address. When it comes to colors and brightness, well, first of all, the good news is that 400 nits of quoted peak brightness is perfectly accurate. I saw anywhere between 415 and 425 nits in my testing. Strangely though, the gamma curve seems pretty far off. Like actually really far off. For comparison's sake, here it is up against that BenQ panel that I mentioned earlier. The BenQ one is much flatter down in the dark areas, which if I now add in the actual Gamma 2.2 curve, you can see what it's actually meant to look like. Now bear in mind the Gamma 2.2 curve is actually at 0 down at the bottom, but because these monitors don't have any full array local dimming, they can't just turn off the backlight fully, they can't get to full black as with the backlight still on, and it's kind of like the blinds are closed but some light still leaks through the cracks. You get a slight offset. But either way, looking at the X equals panel, well, that outputs significantly more light at, say, RGB 50 than the BenQ, which is something I noticed while using the monitor during my testing, where it should be, what should be almost black areas still stand out as a dark grey, much more so than you'd see on most other monitors and most other panels. Colors wise though, well, you get around 100% coverage of the sRGB spectrum, give or take, slight variance, but close enough. It's not too bad. Competitors like AOC's CU34G2X offers which is also a curved VA panel and very similar, offer a slightly wider range. It's not too significant, but to the eyes it can look a little muted or dull compared to especially my usual IPS panels that I both use day to day and review. So again, take that with a pinch of salt as you like. Also, the quoted 4000:1 contrast ratio appears to be more like 2800:1, give or take, depending on which sort of peak brightness figure you take. Still not horrific, but again, not quite the the claim. Now, you could argue that I've been somewhat hard on this monitor, considering it's meant to be a budget option. If it costs like £250 or £300, then I could happily forgive almost all of my grievances with it. That'd be a pretty great deal, even if the monitor itself is far from perfect. So, how much is it? Oh, it's £400. Yeah, that's only about £40 less than Gigabyte's G34WQC, an equally curved 1440p high refresh rate VA panel or based monitor that is likely to have much better build quality, overdrive tuning, and gamma curves, or another tenner would net you a AOC CU34G2X, which is again, very similar panel with likely better build quality, well actually definitely better build quality, overdrive tuning, and gamma curves. Or you could even go with a flat IPS monitor from Iyama, their GB3461WQSU, which I've actually reviewed in the past, and it's a legitimately impressive option, so maybe take a look at that review if you haven't already. On the whole, I'm not sure if I can recommend this monitor, at least for now. Most of the problems that I've spoken about are really just one solid firmware update away from being either solved completely or at least dramatically improved. If that were to happen, if they were to invest some time into tweaking the overdrive lookup tables, correcting the gamma curve, and ideally knocking just a touch more off the price, I think like $380 would be perfect for this, then I would happily excuse the build quality and relatively slow response times that you just can't get away from because it's a curved VA panel, and be happy to recommend it. With that said, those are my thoughts, but I would love to hear yours in the comments down below. What do you think of the monitor, the panel, the response times, the gamma curve? Would you wait for that sort of proposed firmware updates, or would you just go ahead and buy one now, or maybe just something else entirely, whether that's 16:9 or the flat IPS Iyama monitor I mentioned, or just a direct competitor? Feel free to let me know in those comments down below. If you want to check one of these out or pick one up yourself, then I'll leave a link to AWD IT, who both sent me the monitor and actually make the monitor, in the description. That's not an affiliate link, it's just where you can buy one, although I think they also list it on Amazon, so I'll potentially leave an Amazon link down there as well, which will be an affiliate link. Otherwise, there are plenty of ways to both stay up to date on all of the new videos from me. Of course, that subscribe button and the bell notification icon. But you can also check out a whole load more on the end cards, including more monitor reviews and also the new smart home series I'm starting as well. You can also check out the links in the description for ways to support the channel. There's obviously the YouTube join button, but stuff like Patreon, merch, hoodies, or t-shirts like this one, or a load of other cool designs. There's also some affiliate links that you can check out if you're buying from places like Overclocks UK or VPN options, Hubble Mono, Streamlabs OBS, that kind of stuff. And yeah, that's kind of that really. Apologies for me being ill. I can't really help it, and need to get some videos done. So yeah, hope it was alright, and I hope you enjoy the video. We'll see you on the next one.